Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
5 years married to a man like Zach wasn't something I ever imagined would be part of my story, but I'll say this much, it gave me a front row seat to the kind of arrogance money can buy, and by the end of it, I knew exactly how to turn it against him. From the outside, everything about our marriage looked perfect, like a curated magazine spread come to life. There was the sprawling stone house with the wraparound porch, the perfectly groomed golden retriever that I never actually wanted but ended up loving more than him, the joint photo shoots for charity events and fundraisers, and of course, this dinner. Our 5-year anniversary celebration at his favorite overpriced steakhouse downtown. The place smelled like leather chairs and aged whiskey, the kind of setting where men in pressed suits could laugh too loud without anyone telling them to be quiet. Every guest we'd ever fake smiled at showed up that night. His business partners, his golf buddies, women I barely knew who insisted on calling themselves my friends because our husbands shared tax attorneys. The lights were low and warm, the wine flowed like we owned the damn vineyard, and Zach made sure to sit at the head of the table like he was a king instead of the court jester I'd come to know behind closed doors. I wore the black satin dress he used to like back when he was still pretending to be in love, the one with the slit just high enough to remind him that I knew how to work a room. I smiled, I toasted, I complimented Lisa's earrings even though I knew where she'd really been the night before. I played my part because tonight was going to be the finale of the whole production, and I didn't come this far to flinch when the lights got hot. Right before dessert, Zach stood, glass in hand, and cleared his throat like he was about to deliver a eulogy, and in a way, I guess he was. 5 years, he started, his voice loud enough to hush the murmurs and clinking silverware. 5 long years married to a woman who married me for my money. There were a few awkward chuckles, some nervous glances, but he didn't stop. He smiled wider, like he was proud of what he was about to say next. 5 years wasted on a gold-digging nobody. But hey, at least she knows how to pick a wine list. The laughter this time was louder, not from humor, but from disbelief, that uncomfortable kind that only happens when people aren't sure if they're supposed to laugh or gasp. I didn't blink. I didn't twitch. I just reached into my bag and slid a thick white folder across the table in his direction. The room went silent so fast it felt like the air had been vacuumed out of it. He looked down at the folder like it was a joke, like maybe I'd brought his golf scores or some novelty coupon book, but his face changed fast. It's a wild thing to watch someone's confidence evaporate in real time. I leaned forward just a little, just enough so he'd have to hear me over the sound of his own panic, and I said, "Funny, because this fake prenup means you get nothing." I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I smiled the same polite, practiced smile I'd used for years at cocktail parties while pretending I didn't know exactly who he was. "And those texts with Lisa?" I added, casually sipping my wine. "They just went to everyone you know." He blinked, confused, until I raised my phone and pressed a single button, the one marked Send All. Every guest's phone buzzed almost in unison. A symphony of pings, dings, and vibrating tables filled the room, and I sat back in my chair like a woman who had just dropped a lit match into a dry field of lies and was ready to watch the flames. People started pulling out their phones, eyes wide as they scrolled through screenshots of texts and photos. There were messages between Zach and Lisa, his sister's best friend. By the way, some romantic, some obscene, all time-stamped and saved in chronological order. There were receipts from the hotel downtown, snapshots of room service orders for two, selfies he thought were deleted, and even one particularly charming audio message where he said, "Rachel doesn't have the spine to leave me. She's lucky I even tolerate her." As the realization dawned across every smug face at the table, I watched the color drain from Zach's. I'd waited for this moment for so long, not out of bitterness, not even out of anger, but because when someone builds a life out of disrespect, you don't owe them a quiet exit. You owe them a front row seat to their own downfall. Zach reached for my arm like he could still control the outcome, but I pulled back, slow and deliberate. "Don't," I said quietly, with just enough bite to stop him cold. He didn't know it yet, but there were lawyers in the next room. 2 of them. One from my firm and one from his, both holding divorce papers that were going to hit him harder than any slap across the face. Because here's what he never realized while he was busy bragging about his empire and his investments and how lucky I was to have him. I wasn't some desperate girl clinging to a man for status. I had a degree in estate law, a list of contacts longer than his trust fund, and more importantly, I had patience. I let him build his tower of ego as high as he wanted, because I knew one day I'd yank the bottom brick and watch it all crash down. And it started tonight. With a toast. And a folder. And a little ding from every phone in the room. The moment their phones lit up, I could almost hear the unspoken panic roll across the room like thunder approaching fast over an open field. There was a stillness first, just a few blinking guests, eyes widening in silence. Then came the sudden rustling of purses. The flickers of screens being raised to faces, the kind of simultaneous horror and curiosity you only see when someone knows they're witnessing a slow-motion train wreck, but can't seem to look away. It was beautifully choreographed, really. I didn't need to say another word because every message, every emoji-laced whisper from Zach to Lisa, every after-midnight hotel reservation was already doing the speaking for me. Loud and clear in group texts and private threads I'd carefully loaded with all the receipts. Zach just stood there, still holding his champagne flute like it might save him, frozen somewhere between disbelief and denial, the smugness draining from his expression like spilled wine across a white tablecloth. The texts were brutal, not just the betrayal part, not just the photos of him with Lisa in hotel bathrooms or the selfies taken while I was supposedly out of town visiting my mother, but the tone, the mockery, the pure smug disdain. There was one message that read, "She's too dumb to notice. I made her sign a prenup, remember? She gets nothing." I had that one starred, bolded, and repeated across multiple slides because I wanted to make sure no one could pretend they didn't see it. And that's when I leaned in, smiling as if someone had just complimented my earrings and said, "You always did like your little jokes, Zach. Too bad you signed the wrong document." His face twitched, a blink, a twitch, then confusion. He didn't know it yet, but that fake prenup he kept referencing was nothing more than a glorified napkin scribble, a template my best friend Amber had downloaded off some sketchy online forum and customized just enough to look convincing. The real prenup, the one I'd had drawn up before we even got married, was ironclad and sitting in a safety deposit box with my name on it. You see, Amber isn't just my best friend. She's also a paralegal in my old law firm, and one hell of a creative strategist when properly motivated. She was there the night I first suspected something wasn't right, 3 months ago, right after our second anniversary. I had come home late from work. Wait, no, sorry, that doesn't make any sense. We were celebrating 5 years, so I must have meant 3 years ago, not 3 months after the second anniversary. That's what happens when your memory gets tangled in betrayal. You lose track of the timeline sometimes, but the feelings, those stay sharp. Back then, I caught Zach whispering into his phone in the guest bathroom, thinking I was still outside loading groceries. He claimed it was a work call, but the tone was too intimate, too soft, like someone speaking to a lover rather than a contractor. I didn't confront him that night. I waited. I started watching, taking mental notes, and then real notes. I copied receipts, bank transactions, the way his phone would buzz at 1:17 a.m. every Thursday like clockwork. I found one of Lisa's hairpins under the couch cushions and tucked it away, just in case. Amber helped me sort it all into folders, chronological, color-coded, airtight. We weren't just preparing for a confrontation. We were building a case. I wanted him to believe he was winning. I wanted him so secure in his illusion that he didn't see the trap until he'd stepped right in the center of it. Every passive comment I let slide, every smile I gave when he showed up late smelling like someone else's perfume, it was all part of the performance. I pretended I hadn't seen the texts. I pretended not to know he brought Lisa to our lake house one weekend I was at a conference. I even sent him reminders to pack sunscreen for that trip, because nothing feels better than outwitting someone who thinks you're beneath them. And now here we were, 5 years later, and dessert hadn't even been served yet. As the whispers grew louder, the room turned against him faster than I think he ever imagined. His golf buddies were already awkwardly excusing themselves to check on the valet, while the wives looked at me with a mix of pity and admiration, like they'd just watched someone escape a trap they were still sitting inside themselves. Lisa, who'd shown up late to dinner thinking she could smile her way through the night, was now hiding her face behind her curls like maybe she'd vanish if no one made eye contact. Then, right on cue, the doors to the private dining room opened. Two people stepped in, my attorney, dressed sharper than sin, and a courier holding a small stack of manila envelopes. They didn't say a word. Just walked right up to Zach, asked him to verify his name, and then handed him the divorce papers like they were delivering an invitation to a party he'd long been disinvited from. One envelope for Zach. One for Lisa. One for Zach's personal assistant, who I suspected had been covering up more than calendar conflicts. He looked up at me, pleading now, eyes searching for the version of me who used to look away when he failed me. But she was gone. That woman, who once believed she could love him into becoming decent, had been buried under every lie he ever told. I raised my glass and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Cheers to new beginnings." And then I took the first bite of cake like it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. The next morning started with birds chirping and espresso bubbling in my kitchen, but the silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded, like the air before a thunderstorm, all static and pressure. The kind that warns you something big is about to happen whether you're ready or not. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in the front room of my house, emphasis on mine, waiting to watch Zach try to walk through the front door like he still owned the place. What he didn't know, and what he was about to learn the hard way, was that he had signed that right away along with his dignity the second he agreed to the prenup he never read, the one I'd written with the help of my late mentor, Mr. Victor Harlan. A man so shrewd in estate law, he made divorce sound like chess and taught me to never play defense when you're holding the queen. The real prenup, buried behind the decoy one had bragged about to his mistress, had a clause that would have made him laugh if he hadn't already been too busy choking on his own arrogance. It stated clearly, in plain black ink, that should Zachary Lewis engage in extramarital conduct demonstrable by video, photo, or witness confirmation, he would forfeit immediate access to all jointly titled property, including our primary residence, vehicles, and any shared investment portfolios pending arbitration. I didn't even need the witness confirmation, though Amber would have gladly testified, because I had something better. Footage. For different clips, actually, pulled from the security system he insisted on installing after a break-in in the neighborhood. The one he said was for peace of mind. Turned out it brought me a lot more peace than he ever intended. The first clip showed Lisa arriving at our house on a Thursday afternoon, entering through the side gate like a seasoned pro. The second had Zach and Lisa standing way too close in the kitchen, drinks in hand, him laughing at something with his hand on her hip, right in front of the espresso machine I bought for our 3rd anniversary. The third was bedroom footage, which I didn't watch past the first few seconds because honestly, the point was never to punish myself with details, just to prove the truth. And the last one was my favorite, Zach, 2 days before our anniversary dinner, dancing in the living room with Lisa to the exact same playlist he used to make for me. That one I sent to his mother. No caption. Just the file. So when he pulled up in the driveway that morning, still in yesterday's dress shirt, bags under his eyes and fury in his step, I watched him march to the door, punch in the code, and blink when the lock didn't turn. He tried again, slower this time, like maybe he'd fat-fingered it, and then he banged on the door with the palm of his hand like a man who just realized he had no power left in his voice. I opened the door just enough for him to see my face, but not enough for him to take a single step inside. Per Clause 9, Section B of the prenup you never read, I said, cool as iced tea, you've officially forfeited all access to this property, effective immediately. I watched the words hit him like bricks and I didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, but his voice came out smaller than I expected. You can't be serious. I'm entirely serious, I said, sliding the envelope with the security footage toward him on the doorstep. And just in case you were wondering whether I'd be generous about the joint accounts, don't be. Every shared asset is currently frozen. Every one. I spoke with the bank manager this morning. You're locked out. He tried to argue, to claim I was bluffing, but the truth had already wrapped around him like a noose. I had moved all legal documents into motion weeks ago, ever since I caught the first whiff of something off in his behavior. It didn't take much to transfer the business ownership structure either, just a few signatures and a little creativity. See, when Victor passed, he left behind not just advice, but templates. Legal ones. Precise ones. And I'd adapted one of them to create an amendment Zach unknowingly signed during a routine paperwork session for a property deal last year. That amendment quietly transferred 35% of his company's shares, my shares now, back under my full control, triggered automatically upon the filing of divorce proceedings. What I didn't account for was Eli. Eli, his business partner of 6 years, was the only one who hadn't reacted the way I expected. He hadn't called, hadn't emailed, hadn't even replied to the lawyer's notice. At first I assumed he was just giving Zach space or trying to stay neutral, but then Amber mentioned she saw him the night after the dinner, sitting alone at a bar downtown, looking like he'd seen a ghost. And that's when something started to itch at the edge of my certainty. Eli knew something. Or he was part of something. I didn't know which yet, but his silence spoke louder than any outburst would have. Later that evening, while Zach was undoubtedly calling every lawyer in his overpriced contact list, I started going through the last of his belongings, just the personal stuff he hadn't had a chance to grab before the lockout. That's when I found it. In the side pocket of his golf bag, beneath a sleeve of untouched balls and a flask that smelled like cheap bourbon, was a second phone. Not his regular one. This was smaller, older, unregistered. No case, no fingerprint lock, just a simple passcode that took me all of 4 tries to crack. And when I got inside, the texts weren't just from Lisa. There were messages from numbers I didn't recognize, conversations that didn't make sense, references to wire transfers and meeting spots and code words that sounded like something out of a cheap spy movie. I sat there, holding the phone like it was radioactive, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry, I was scared. Because this wasn't just infidelity. This was something else entirely. And I had a very bad feeling I was about to find out what. I've always believed there's a difference between anger and fear. Anger comes hot and loud, burning through your chest like a fuse, while fear is quiet and sharp, the kind of cold that creeps in slow and doesn't leave even when you beg. That second phone, the one I found tucked inside Zach's golf bag, brought me both emotions in equal measure, but it was the fear that rooted itself first. At first glance, it was easy to assume this burner phone was nothing more than a sleazy insurance policy, a way to keep in touch with Lisa without risking me or his business partners seeing the texts. But after a few scrolls through the thread list, I realized this wasn't just for Lisa. There were messages from her, yes, plenty of them, photos, voice notes, gross little jokes that made my stomach flip, but those weren't the ones that made my throat tighten. One number caught my eye, saved under the name M, with no emoji, no last name, just that one letter. The messages were more spaced out, less romantic, and more strategic. Words like handled, transferred, proof scrubbed, and Rachel doesn't know a thing weren't flirty. They were clinical, cold, professional. And one name stood out in one of the earlier texts, like a blade slipping through fabric. I told you she wouldn't remember me. I scrolled further and found the photo. A blurry image taken through a car window, probably zoomed in from across a parking lot. But I knew that face. I hadn't seen her in years, but I knew her. Her name was Meredith Callahan. And back before I ever married Zach, before I even thought about saying yes to the first dinner date, she was the woman who pulled me aside in the powder room at a charity auction and told me one sentence I never forgot. She said, "Be careful, he doesn't like women who ask questions." I thought she was bitter. I thought she was jealous. I thought maybe she was just some unstable ex trying to stir the pot, and like an idiot, I smiled politely, told her I appreciated the warning, and then ignored every word of it. Now, 5 years later, she was messaging my husband through a burner phone using code words and surveillance photos like they were running a side gig in espionage. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Why would Meredith be involved now? And more importantly, Why would Zach still be talking to her? I sat with that phone in my hand for over an hour, staring at the screen until the glow started to blur and my head started to pound. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I couldn't talk to Zach. Lisa was probably hiding under some rock. And while Amber had been my rock through this mess, even her loyalty started to feel fragile with this much deception spinning around me. The fear crept in deeper when I opened the latest message, time-stamped from just 2 days before the dinner. It read, "All assets consolidated. Paper trail eliminated. Timeline clean. You're clear, just don't let her find the old file." I didn't know what the hell the old file was, but I knew one thing for certain. It was about me. I didn't know what they were hiding or why they were covering tracks, but this wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was something bigger. Something that went back further than I ever realized. Meanwhile, the fallout from the dinner had already started exploding in all directions. That slideshow I dropped like a nuclear warhead had spread beyond the walls of that private dining room. Someone, I suspected Lisa out of pure bitterness, or possibly one of Zach's backstabby friends, had forwarded the entire file to a popular local gossip blogger who ran a site known for juicy real estate scandals and ugly divorce exposés. It didn't take long before the story made the rounds. Local mogul cheats on wife with sister's best friend, gets served divorce papers during cake. Catchy. Brutal. Effective. By the end of the week, Zach's email inbox was flooded with angry clients, half of them backing out of deals, and the other half demanding clarity. One investment group dropped him completely. Another froze a multi-million-dollar escrow until public image liabilities were addressed. His PR firm quit. One of his charity partners pulled a statement and issued a subtle but pointed press release. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd been served with a second lawsuit related to breach of contract, because one of the properties he'd tried to push in a recent deal had Lisa's name buried in the paperwork, and now everything was being questioned. Zach was unraveling, one thread at a time. But I wasn't feeling triumphant anymore. I was feeling watched. That night, I woke up to the sound of a car door slamming outside, and when I peeked through the blinds, a black sedan I didn't recognize was pulling away from the curb. Nothing illegal. Nothing overt. But enough to make me double-check every lock in the house. Enough to make me wonder if I had gone too far or if I hadn't gone far enough. I tried calling Amber 3 times that morning. Straight to voicemail. By noon, I was pacing the kitchen, still holding the burner phone in one hand and trying to decide whether I should go to the police, a private investigator, or straight to the nearest airport. And then, right as I was about to dial her again, my phone buzzed. Amber's name flashed across the screen, and I picked up instantly, heart racing. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She just said, flat, quiet, serious in a way I hadn't heard from her before, "Rachel, you need to sit down. There's one more thing you need to see." And right then, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There's a different kind of silence that settles in your bones when you're walking towards something you've been avoiding for years, not out of fear that it might hurt, but because you know deep down it will confirm every terrible thing you hoped you'd imagined. That was the silence wrapped around me as I drove to Amber's house, fingers clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that the skin along my knuckles went white. She hadn't told me what it was I needed to see, just that it was something old, something personal, and something I had once asked her never to show me again. I parked outside her house, the same cozy little place we'd drank boxed wine on the porch of a dozen times, where we laughed about men and bosses and bad haircuts and what we'd do if we were ever brave enough to burn it all down. Amber opened the door before I even knocked, her expression unreadable, serious in a way that made my chest tighten. She didn't say anything at first, just motioned for me to follow her inside, through the kitchen, into her office, where she handed me a manila folder that felt heavier than it looked. I recognized it before I even opened it. The handwriting on the label was mine. It was a letter, dated 7 years ago. The same month, I met Zach at a networking event in the city where he accidentally spilled coffee on my dress and offered to buy me a new one. I had written this letter on Amber's couch later that week, drunk on Pinot Noir and adrenaline, and then promptly sealed it away like a time capsule for a version of me I hoped I'd never have to be. But I had been her all along, hadn't I? My hands shook slightly as I opened it and started to read. Dear me, it began. This is your reminder. Don't fall for the eyes. Don't fall for the smile. You know who he is. You know what he did to her. He doesn't get a second chance. Not even if he begs. And then the memories came flooding back so fast they knocked the wind out of me. My sister, Marla. 3 years before I ever met Zach, she dropped out of college and moved across the state after getting involved in what she thought was a real estate investment startup. She was young, bright-eyed, hungry to prove she didn't need a degree to make her way. The man running the project promised her partnership, profit, and a family of visionaries. But that man? His name wasn't on the paperwork. He used an alias then, one that never made it into the news when the whole thing fell apart. People lost money. Contracts vanished. And Marla, my beautiful, brilliant sister, was left with nothing but debt and a broken voice. She tried to sue, but everything had been funneled through shell companies and fake addresses. The man disappeared. And then he reappeared in my life, with a new name, a new face, and a coffee cup, accidentally, aimed at my blouse. Zachary Lewis. Of course, it wasn't his real last name. But it was the one he used now. And I knew, God, I knew from that first smile who he was. I knew what he'd done to my sister, even though she never got justice. She stopped talking about it eventually, told everyone she'd been scammed by a random stranger and left the state. But I never forgot. That's why I married him. Not for love. Not even for revenge, not at first. It started as strategy. A long con. A way to get close, to figure out how he operated, to find what he'd buried and who helped him bury it. I told myself I'd play the game for a year, maybe 2, then blow it all up and walk away with enough evidence to make sure he never did to another woman what he did to Marla. But then things got complicated. Because Zach didn't just fall for me. He invested in me. He gave me access, gave me power, and I started to forget, just a little, why I was there. Until the cheating started. Until the lies crept in. Until Lisa's earrings turned up under my bed and I remembered the truth of who he was and who I had always been. A woman with a plan. A woman who wasn't going to waste pain without payoff. Amber had kept the letter all these years, quietly guarding it like a relic of war, waiting for the moment I would need to read it and remind myself that this wasn't an accident. That what I did to Zach wasn't cruel, it was calculated. I didn't destroy a marriage. I exposed a man who never deserved one. I left her house a few hours later, after crying harder than I had in a decade, clutching the letter like a lifeline and knowing there was still one final thing to do. I sat down at home with the burner phone, the one filled with messages I hadn't decoded yet, with names and numbers and phrases that didn't make sense, and I finally started typing out a deletion path. I was ready to erase it all, erase him, erase Lisa, erase Meredith's and every twisted knot they'd tangled around my life. But just as I was about to hit delete, the screen lit up. A new message. From a number labeled only as unknown. It read, "Nice move. Now it's my turn." And my stomach dropped in a way it hadn't in years. Because I wasn't sure if this game was over. Or if it was just getting started.